that kind of represent maybe a different way of being human or a different way of being a Christian or whatever. That's kind of what my story is. So PJ said, basically just share your story. So I'm going to root it in a verse that you guys have been talking about in Romans 12, verse 6. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. So you all have to know that no matter who you are, no matter what your past has been, no matter the mistakes you've made, God can and will use you very differently than he's going to use anybody else. You got to know that you are unique, and never look around at other people and say, that's the way I'm supposed to be used just because they're being used that way. You got to understand the uniqueness of your life, your calling, your history. And my story is, there's a lot of pastors that I know who grew up in the church. I did not grow up in the church. Some of you did not grow up in the church. I had a very atheistic background. My dad was such a hardened atheist that he did not want us to go to church. So we had no church, no Bible, no God, nothing. My brother's name is Matthew, and he didn't even want his name to be Matthew because my dad was like, no, that's a Bible name. And then 4 years later, they had me and named me Mark. So clearly this guy had never picked up a Bible before in his life. He had no idea what the Bible was. My middle name is Andrew. My brother's middle name is James. So we have 4 disciples knocking out. But this guy literally had no clue. He didn't like God, didn't like church, he didn't like anything. He ended up dying when I was 15 years old, and he never even called me, told me about anything to do with his life or that he was sick or anything. And some of you have parents that have passed away too, and you wonder, am I the kind of person God could ever use? And some of you are sitting here right now, you're going, I've made too many mistakes, I've done too many things. I am the poster boy for God can never use me. I come from that home. Where there's a skepticism about God, a hermeneutic of suspicion about Christianity or anything. And so when my parents got divorced when I was about 8 years old, the trauma of that moment, actually living through that, gave me something called Tourette's syndrome, which is not a way to be cool in high school at all. If you know anything about Tourette's, it's like you get all these like random like tics and habits that you do, which is why I'm up here and I twitch my body around and my face moves around and I do weird noises. It's because I had Tourette's. The trauma of my parents' divorce created that in me. And so I would do a ton of habits growing up. Like I would stand at a bus stop when I was like 13 years old on my way to high school and just swear. I just like, if you've ever seen anyone on YouTube or whatever as Tourette's, they'll just be dropping F-bombs, like F, right? And I used to stand at the bus stop and just be like, F, like not the letter F, but the word. I'd be F, F you, F. That was literally one of my tics. So the one job that you're never gonna get in life when you just randomly throw F-bombs around is a preacher, right? Because that's not gonna work. It's like, welcome to my church, get in the F small group. So it's like, literally one of my habits was like, I used to like give people the finger like this. Like, so this is not a good thing for church life. So the one thing that's never going to work in my life is to ever be a preacher. And yet, in the midst of all of that, this is precisely what God called me to do. I didn't grow up in any of it, but when I was about 18 in high school, I met a guy named Chris. And he came up in woodworking class and he told me about Jesus. And I was a skeptic. And so I wasn't just going to come to faith because it felt good or whatever. So I started exploring Christianity and the history and the philosophy. And I started studying science and realizing that, anything that begins to exist has to have a cause. The universe began to exist, ergo the universe has to have a cause. I started studying morality and philosophy and psychology and history and literature and began realizing that Christianity was the best idea in the marketplace of ideas. And I gave my life to Christ. And it was a little unique because I was the guy who did all the things when you don't grow up in church. I was the chain smoker since I was, the first time I ever did drugs, I was 8 years old. A guy named Todd in our neighborhood, we smoked up together. He was like, hey, this is what it's like. And then in high school, I picked it back up, just started doing drugs. And so I'd be hanging out like in my buddy's garage, and we'd all be just talking, and we'd hotbox the whole garage talking about things. And then I met Jesus, and 3 weeks later, I came back, and I'm in the garage telling them all about Jesus. Right? I'm still high a little bit because we got the garage door closed, but I'm telling them about Jesus. And we're talking about God, and we're talking about giving your life to Christ. And this for 2 years was my life. I would literally just read the Bible. St. Augustine says the Bible is the face of God for us now. And I would just sit and I'd read the Bible and smoke my cigarettes outside of the school, and people would walk up to me like, what are you doing? What are you all about? And I was like, I'm all about Jesus. And I would walk around my neighborhood and I would just tell people about Christ. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I'd walk up and be like, hey, do you know Jesus? I'd walk up to random groups just getting hammered, and I'd start discipling. Like, I'm reading Jesus go, you got to disciple people. You got to create learners. You got to baptize people in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And I'm like, okay, great. Do you want to get baptized? And I would baptize people at 2 o'clock in the morning in the lake near my house before I'd never even been to church yet. I never walked into a church, because church to me was a place that kind of represented, I know exactly what it's going to be. It's going to be, everyone's going to be 200 years old, average age. It's going to be shag carpet and smell like mothballs and death. And that's the last thing I want to do, is go to a church like that. And so I didn't. For 2 years, I just read the Bible, told everybody I could about Jesus. And then finally, like, people would walk up to me, and I would just, like, remember, for those of you who are like been Christians, or maybe you're exploring, remember how like vivid and amazing the Bible is when you first start exploring it? And I don't know if you've had this experience where I just started reading it and started flipping everything in my brain about how to be human and what to do. And so I would just read it, and I'd be reading this Sermon on the Mount, and people would be like, what's that about? And I just like, this is Jesus. And when people come up to you and they say, you know, ask for your T-shirt, give them your jacket as well. And so people are like, hey, can I get a cigarette? I'd be like, yeah, take the whole pack, you know. Jesus wants you to have the whole pack. So I was just jacked up, excited to just do whatever Jesus told me to do. And it was just simple, it was plain, it was clear. That's what I wanted to do. And so I would tell people about Jesus. Finally, I walked into a church. A guy that I knew dragged me to church. I was like, okay, I show up at church. And I'm from Canada. Sorry if I use words any different than you guys do. I heard someone say, someone drugged me somewhere, and I'm like, what did they do? They drugged me to church. I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds violent. So I say dragged, but drug you to church. So anyways, they drugged me to church, and I'm in church, and I mean, of course, it was the only time I wanted to go, and then I met a girl. Right, she was singing up front. I walked right. It was the first day I was ever in church, and this beautiful girl was singing up front. And I'm like, okay, I'm into church. I like this church thing. This is what I'm going to plant myself right here. And we ended up dating, and I married her. 5 years later, we got married, which is kind of cool. So I met this girl in church, and but I remember like what I was going to do is go into the film industry, and a whole bunch of people around me said no. You should actually become a pastor. And it was through these weird supernatural things that they gathered around me and said, we think this is what you're supposed to do. And that was like not my jam, because everyone in church thought Erin, my wife, was dating a non-Christian, to the point where the guy got up one day, the pastor preached a sermon on not being unequally yoked. You know, you're not supposed to date non-Christians. And people walked up to my wife and said, you are supposed to break up with Mark, because she's like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you're not like, he's not a Christian, you're unequally yoked. And she's like, what do you mean he's not a Christian? Why do you think he's not a Christian? And they're like, well, because we saw him smoking outside of the church, which is kind of weird, because I used to go behind the church before the service and smoke, but there's a huge window, and I didn't realize like the whole worship, and this was the senior pastor's office, so they were all in there before the worship service, and I'm like, well, let's. So they're all watching me. So this guy walks up and says that, and my wife's like, well, what was he smoking? And he's like, well, you know, cigarettes or whatever. And she's like, oh, that's better than what he used to smoke, right? And so it's like, so it's like you can't never judge a person where they're at. You always got to look where they're coming from. And that's when Paul talks about grace. It's grace has been distributed to every single one of us vastly differently than other people. He's going to use you the way he's going to use you, with all your past and experience. And so I started going, okay, maybe I should become a pastor, and moved out to Vancouver, Canada. And my heart for being a pastor kind of went away after being in ministry for a bit. And I got a heart for academics, because I really wanted to. I love scholarship. I love footnotes. I love sitting in a library just with ideas, because ideas aren't stupid. Like people are the worst. So when you're a pastor, you start with the assumption that I have to be about people, but people are the worst. They like, start a singles ministry in your church. Like they're just whining and complaining all the time. So I didn't want to do that. So pastoring was off, and I just wanted to be an academic and get a PhD and be a teacher. And then God, when I was in Vancouver, said, no, this isn't what you're going to do. You're going to plant a church. And so I was like, well, this kind of sucks because I'm in post-Christian, Canada is very post-Christian, like at least a generation ahead or two of America in regard to secularization and secular thinking and structures and the way education works and politics work, and it's in the water far more than here. So I was like, well, I'm going to start a church, but this sucks because I'm on the progressive side of a very progressive, no one loves God here, so it's going to be difficult. And he's like, yeah, just do it. So I started this church with 16 people in my house and just started going through the Bible. And they were like, okay, well, what are we going to do? Because and I said, we're going to start a church. Just tell people about Jesus. And they're like, well, yeah. But then I went to all these things that were trying to teach you how to plant a church. And every one of them said, you can't just open the Bible in Canada. No one cares about it in Canada. You got to speak Canadian. So you got to be like, hey, everybody, thanks for coming. You have ideas and I have ideas, and we all have ideas. Sorry, we're all equals. And I was like, this sounds like the worst church experience. So I just started this church in this elementary school gym and just opened up my Bible, and I would just preach verse by verse through the Bible. It took me one of the series that we started with, that everybody said no one would show up to church. We would just preach. It took me 3.5 years to get through the Gospel of Matthew. That was our sermon series. I mean, it was like, well, what's our sermon series? It's Matthew. It's like people have families, die, have babies. What's our sermon series? It's still Matthew. We're just going here. And in that time, the church started to grow, which is kind of strange. People started to meet Jesus. And I would tell them that they are selfish and sinful and narcissistic, and the one common denominator in their life to all of their problems is them. But that's okay, because the hero of their life shouldn't be themselves. It should be a guy named Jesus. And here's what Jesus did. He lived a perfect life in your place, and he died on a cross for your sin, and he rose again to give you life, and you need to turn from yourself and give your life to him. And all these Canadians would go, this is so offensive. I'm going to go get my friend. And they go get their friend, and their friend would show up, and then they'd meet Jesus, and their addictions would get healed, and their marriages would get healed, and this crazy move of God started to happen, and these 50 people became 150, became 300, and then became 400, and then we couldn't fit them in this little gym anymore, so we were like, what are we going to do? We're going to have to go to the 2-service system, and if those of you who go to church, you got 2 services, well, that's a really hard decision for a pastor, because then everyone's coming up to me and complaining, and they're like, why are you going to 2 services? I'm not going to be able to see Joanne, and we're going to have dinner, and it's all about community, and I'm like, okay. So I got up the next week and I said, listen, I didn't start a church for you to get more friends. I started a church because every single day people like my dad die and go to hell. So next week we're going to 2 services. And you can figure you and Joanne out, but we're going to 2 services. And the next week we went to 2 services and we grew by 50 people. She left. So 49 people in a week just by going to 2 services. And this thing started to happen. 400 became 900, became 2,000, and these campuses started to grow across Canada. Post-Christian, anti-God Canada. And over the course of a lot of years, all these people met Jesus, and I saw a legitimate move of God happen. That for some reason, when I started our church, I'm the most unlikely person to do this because I have Tourette's. This doesn't make no sense. When I planted my church, when you're trying to gather people and be all cool, you got to be the cool church, you got to be the cool. You know what my tick at the time was? Kissing the air like this. Try to gather a core with that tick. Hey, how you doing? Want to join my church, man? No joke. For the 6 months we started our church, that was like, hey, welcome to the church. Open up your, even now when I'm doing it, I have to stop because I'll start to pick that tick up again, right? That's just why, I can't hang out with people with Tourette's because it's like my buddy's like, oh, you should do lunch. My other buddy's got Tourette's. I'm like, bro, I'll pick up 3 habits before the check comes. I'm not hanging out with your buddy. It's bizarre because, even the other day, I was driving somewhere at 7 o'clock in the morning. I stopped in a Starbucks, and these 2 people they're like, oh, we go to your church, and thank you so much for what you do. And as I'm talking to them, I had to sneeze. So I was like, and then And they're kind of looking at me, and they didn't say, God bless you, because they thought it was a tick, right? And they just thought, because here's the thing, God is going to use you, not because of you, but in spite of you. God is going to take your differences, your weirdness, your complexity, your messed up past and your history, and the fact that your parents didn't. Listen, I come from every statistical option should be that I'm either in jail or dead. I got the broken home. I got the mental health. I got a family who's not part of a church. I live in not a rich part of the neighborhood. Like, this was my life growing up. And yet, I didn't decide to blame my circumstances or blame my parents or blame whatever. It was like I worked hard, and by the grace of God rose above those circumstances so that I can't blame people. And God has a place for you. This is the whole point of that verse. And grace just means it's just different. You're all recipients of grace. But your complexity and your weirdness and your history and your past, God is going to take it and he's going to use it. Because Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher in the 1800s, he says this. He says, stop trying to offer God your strength. He has all of that. Offer him your weakness because he has none of that in himself. All of your stuff, all the reasons you think God couldn't do anything with me, he will take and he will use it, and he will actually let it set other people free. I remember the weekend that I shared about my obsessive compulsive disorder to our church. I would just use it as a sermon illustration. I was like, hey, my obsessive compulsive is that I used to have to hit certain things certain times if we were getting on a plane, and I kind of hit a post, and I realized I didn't hit the post twice, and I walked all the way to the gate. I'd have to come back and hit it multiple times, and I'd have to click a certain thing a certain amount of times. And there was a habit that I had where I would have to go down on my knees, like bam, 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 and I would walk, and it was like every 20 feet I go bam, bam down on my knees, which is crazy because I was a smoker, so that means I'm outside in the snow in Toronto, banging down on the snow in the middle. So that means I'm walking around, and I got wet pants on my knee. It's like, wow, what a loser. In the midst of all that, I shared this obsessive compulsive thing, and it's very funny how God used that to set people free. Because they came up to me, a woman walked up to me on the Monday after I shared that, and she was crying, and she said, for 20 years, I sit and I fold laundry, and I think, if this corner doesn't touch this corner, my husband's going to die in a car accident. And if this corner doesn't touch this corner, it means my kids are going to get some disease. And she's like, I thought I was the only person in the world that thought like that until you gave that sermon illustration. For 20 years, I lived in absolute secrecy. And now I realize that other people are just like me. And the crazy thing was, literally right up to last week, I was speaking down in Palm Springs and with a group of pastors, 30 pastors from around the country, and we were talking about preaching and leadership and whatever, and I shared that illustration to tell them to make sure you use your flaws, lead from a limp. That authenticity gives people freedom. They can find themselves in your imperfection. And the guy, literally, one of the 30 pastors walks up to me bawling at the end. He goes, oh my goodness, I didn't know that anyone else thought like that. And he started riffing on how he thinks about stuff. And I realized that when you hold that in, man, it doesn't help anybody else. And it doesn't, see, every time if I baptize people and there's 60 people getting baptized in the ocean, which is what amazing thing, we go out in the ocean and we baptize these people, it'd be 40 to 50 degree water, freezing cold in the ocean in Vancouver, people get baptized. And every time that would happen, it was very clear who was the one doing it. Because there I am, doing my little ticks. And there's all these people getting baptized because God decided to show up. And God looks big when you look small. And your job is to point people away from you and toward him. And the fact that God is using you in whatever way, not because you're the hero of the story, but because he is. And he's going to use your life in all of your uniqueness. You have such an opportunity and a moment to say, God, use me in whatever way you want to use me. but let me point people to your perfection, not mine. That's our whole job. He must increase, I must decrease. That's the whole thing. And so that passage in Romans 12 about the differences. You've got these gifts, you've got these gifts. It's all different. You know what the biggest thing that will destroy your contentment in life? Comparison. It will destroy. The biggest toxicity to your contentment is to compare yourself to anyone. And when I do marriage counseling with people, I will look at a wife or a husband and I'll say, here's your problem. The reason you're not content with your wife is because you scroll Instagram and you compare her body to every other body of every other woman out there, and it's destroying your contentment. And then I'll look to the wife and say, you know what you do? You scroll Instagram and you go, why don't I go on vacations more? Why doesn't my husband make any more money? I notice Tom goes to Hawaii every 6 months. I haven't been to Hawaii in 5 years. What's wrong with my husband, Brian? Brian, step it up and be more like Tom. And every time you do that, you go against the biblical model, which is Adam and Eve in a garden, and they only have each other, and there are no other options. There's Adam or hippo. Those are the options. And so when you get married, don't think about that too long. When you get married, your evaluation is now your spouse. You don't get to scroll everything on the internet and compare them and all their flaws to everybody else on the planet. It will destroy you. And when you think of your gifting and your talent and where you're going to go in life, and they're smarter than you and they're better than you at this, that's not your calling. Your calling is to go, I am his beloved son, I am his beloved daughter, in whom he is well pleased. That's what the Father declares over Jesus in his baptism in Mark chapter 1. You are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased, and he hasn't even done anything yet. He hasn't preached a sermon. And the Father is saying, this is who you are, no matter what you've done. And if you want to feel good about yourself, when I was a young pastor, 28 years old, just about to plant our church, I told a woman that her husband was dead and I had the wrong guy. She mourned the death of her husband in a room with me for an hour, and I had the wrong person. He was fine. I went into the hospital. I had visited him on a Friday. I went into the hospital to meet him on a Monday. Walked in his room, and he was laying there. I'm like, huh. And just as I looked at him, he wasn't looking as good as on a Friday. The nurse grabbed my shoulder and turned me around. She's like, what's up? I'm like, I'm just here. And she's like, I'm sorry. He passed away this morning. Now, when someone says that, say, who? But I did not. I'm like, okay, must be Dave. You look like him. So I just went back to the office. I told the secretary, Dave's dead, and I went back to work. An hour later, Dave's wife comes into the office carrying a Subway sandwich on her way to visit Dave. Secretary comes to my office. I don't think she knows. Oh, send her back. She comes back to my office. She's like, I'm just going to visit Dave. I was there this morning super early. We sang some great songs. He wanted some Subway, so I went home, had a shower, come back. I'm like, oh, I visited Dave after you left. Dave's dead. At which point, this is 100% true, at which point she passed out into my arms. I put her on the couch, and we mourned the death of Dave for a full hour. Started planning his life, his funeral. She's like, I knew it was sick, but I said, these things happen pretty quick. You know, they could just go downhill quick. And then I went out to get her some water. And I heard the secretary mention the hospital. I'm like, hey, Dave's not in the hospital. He was in that other place that I went and visited him on Friday. She's like, oh, Mark, they moved him on Saturday. What? So they called the other place, and Dave was waiting. He's sitting, oh, yeah, he's right here. He's waiting for his lunch. So I had to walk back into the room. Hey. How you doing? Remember that thing we were talking about? Dave's fine. And she just turned on me and it was weird. She looked at me like could she have the permission to leave? Or why did you do this to me? And you're the worst person. She didn't say any of this, of course, and she left. And my point in telling you this is Satan used that in my life to destroy me. I was 6 months away from planting our church, and he said, don't plant the church. You're playing. You have no idea what it means to be a pastor. You're a child. You're dressing up like a man, and all you're going to do is hurt people. And I almost quit, and I almost didn't do it. And I needed people to come around me and say, you are his beloved son, in whom he is well pleased, and he's going to use you not because of you, not because you're good, not because you're perfect, but because of him, because he's good, because he's perfect. And with all your flaws, go and do this thing. And God used that to do amazing things across Canada in the midst of my mistakes and flaws. So whatever you have done, this isn't I could compare myself to every other pastor out there and go, oh, they would never tell someone their husband was, they would never do this, they would never do this. And God's going, stop comparing yourself to anybody. It's you. It's your story. It's your gifting. It's the way I've wired you different than anybody else. So, Lord, I do pray that anyone in here just needing to hear that you are powerful enough to use us even though we are extremely imperfect and flawed. I pray they'd hear it, that they'd receive it, and they'd understand that your grace is so sufficient in the midst of our weaknesses, that you will use any of us as long as we bring it honestly to you and allow you by your Spirit to use us to make the world treasure you above everything else. To treasure you more than life, to treasure you more than money, to treasure you more than success, to treasure you more than family, that we constantly just deflecting off of ourselves toward you. And in that deflection, we'd be able to walk in our own skin in a way that we would understand that we are different for a reason. In Jesus' great name we pray. Amen.